Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about the future of science and technology. Let's see. I see a variety of questions that came in. Zoe is commenting in the spirit of today, which is Valentine's Day. What is the future of bionic hearts? Would this be a way to make humans more efficient? Okay, so the issue is that the heart, human hearts, are basically pumping blood around the body. You would think, oh, it should be pretty easy to make a pump that just pumps stuff somewhere. You know, the world is full of pumps that pump water through heating and ventilation lines and all this kind of thing. The main trickiness with hearts is that blood is a funny kind of liquid. And in particular, blood, well, in the end, it clots, which is important if you puncture yourself, so to speak, that the blood stops flowing and just forms this eventually a blood clot. But in general, blood is a very complicated fluid, and the thing that you have to do to have a successful pump for blood is to make sure that the blood can never clot. What makes blood start to clot? Well, if blood is in motion, it doesn't clot. It needs to somehow be stopped. It needs to have some place where it's stagnant to be able to clot. So then what's tricky is you start saying, well, let me design my pump, and I have all these surfaces and things are moving and so on, and I've got fluid moving in this direction, but then there may be some place in this whole complicated arrangement of where the fluid moves that's a stagnation point. It's a place where the fluid is actually not moving. That will be a place where the blood clots. So, for example, if you have flow of fluid past an obstacle, like let's say past a sphere or something, there'll be, depending on how fast the fluid is flowing, there can be a stagnation point behind the sphere, a place where the streams of fluid coming from each side of the sphere kind of meet. There's sort of and that can be something where the fluid is actually stationary right behind the sphere, and then there's sort of a bubble of stationary fluid behind the sphere. If that was blood, it would clot there, and then that's a disaster as far as having a sort of working pump for blood. So what makes blood is in the end, it's a suspension of things like blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and so on, mostly red blood cells, in essentially water. But the red blood cells, for example, are very tricky because they're these kind of flat disc-like things with kind of a thicker kind of rim than in the middle, but they deform a lot. So red blood cells are quite flexible, and so, for example, when they go through capillaries, tiny blood vessels, they are actually being deformed as they go through the blood vessel. I don't think they would even fit if that wasn't the case. And also, when you look at, in general, when you look at a pipe, which is sort of an approximation to an artery, for example, is like a pipe with a cylindrical pipe. Then actually the way that a lot of things about fluid flow were first discovered was a chap called Poiseuille, who was doing experiments on blood flow through, I forget, it was veins or arteries of horses. And one thing he discovered was that there is a certain rate of flow of a fluid through a pipe of a certain diameter when you push the fluid through with a certain pressure. What is it? Well, it's eta A. A is the cross-section area. Pressure, yeah, the pressure is equal to some pi, 6 pi. No, that's for a sphere. I forget the coefficient. Eta area times velocity gives you the pressure, so you can kind of invert that to find the velocity in terms of the pressure. But the point is that what Poisson discovered is that if you kind of push the fluid at a certain with a certain pressure, you will get a certain velocity in a pipe of a certain cross-sectional area. There is another coefficient there, which is the so-called viscosity of the fluid, the tendency of the fluid to flow, given that it is pushed at a certain with a certain force. So it's essentially the viscosity is more if you have the most common kind of viscosity is what's called shear viscosity, usually represented with the Greek letter eta. And the shear viscosity is if you have layers of fluid where one of them is going at a certain velocity and the next one is going at a different velocity, it's the amount of force you need to exert to maintain that velocity difference across the fluid. So if the viscosity is very small, it's very easy to get one piece of fluid to kind of just slide smoothly against another piece of fluid. So let's say you have a piece of fluid that's at zero velocity, and you're trying to slide fluid that's at higher velocity. If the viscosity is zero, as it would be, for example, in a superfluid, then you can just slide that other piece of fluid right past. If the viscosity is very high, as it would be in, let's say, syrup or something, it's really hard to slide that other piece of fluid past. You have to put a lot of force in to change the velocity of that fluid. So anyway, the blood is more complicated because it doesn't have a viscosity that is just that is constant as you change the velocity and so on. The types of fluids which are just described by viscosity of the kind I just talked about are usually called Newtonian fluids. I guess old Isaac Newton studied them. You never know, given the name, that it was actually correctly attributed to that person. But I think Isaac Newton did study viscosity. So then the blood is a non-Newtonian fluid that has the feature that its kind of resistance to motion and so on doesn't just depend on the way that the usual viscosity rules are. There are many fluids that are non-Newtonian, whether it's glue or paint or lots of kinds of things that have the feature that they don't quite move the way you would expect based on this formula. But anyway, blood is of this type, and it's a complicated thing because even though the whole sort of Newtonian fluid story of the Poisson's equation of the flow rates as a function of pressure and so on was all discovered actually in blood. It's only an approximation there, and in more detail, it doesn't work that way. And it matters that, for example, the red blood cells line themselves up kind of in one orientation when they're near the side of an artery and a different orientation when they're at the center of the artery. It's kind of a complicated thing. Okay, there's a long story of the main point about the main difficulty in making sort of artificial hearts is having no place where the fluid ever becomes stationary. And there are efforts to make sort of artificial hearts that are all involve solid, hard things, and there are efforts that involve membranes that can give as, for example, the pumping happens. That's what happens in human hearts, is that there's lots of flexibility in the wall of the heart that's important in, for example, preventing clotting and so on. I think and there's also the very fact that the human heart beats in a kind of cyclical way. That's not in many kinds of artificial heart setups. You don't have that. You just have a continuous pump where something is rotating around and trying to pump blood. But in any case, that's been, I think, the one of the main difficulties. And beyond that, I think in modern times, well, there were issues about, I know the first artificial hearts had microprocessors controlling them, and huge amounts of code for all kinds of different situations of having to pump faster because there's more oxygen usage going on, etc. I think that stuff has probably become a lot easier that was all done in the, 1980s, long before, well, at a time when it definitely wasn't possible to, for example, have a quadcopter drone that would successfully and stably fly, because you couldn't have the flight control loop happening fast enough to achieve that. There's probably the same kinds of issues, I don't know specifically, with artificial hearts. So anyway, one kind of approach is you just have purely sort of synthetic materials to make a thing that just serves as a pump for blood. There are other approaches that more involve actually taking much more human-like tissue and filling in pieces of hearts, and maybe the possibility exists to take something where you can sort of 3D print the scaffold of the heart and then fill in the sort of the tissue around it with something where you start from stem cells, and then the way cells in our bodies, the few thousand kinds of cells in our bodies are produced. We all start from just one fertilized egg cell, and it then produces it then divides into more cells and more and more and more cells, and along with that division, the type of cell that you divide into eventually changes, and you'll start producing, a bone marrow cell, and then that turns into certain kind of blood cell, which turns into something else, and so on, in successive divisions. And you can go, I think in humans, is about a dozen levels of progressive division. And the thing that one can do, it's discovered about 15 years ago or something now, was you can take any kind of cell and more or less revert it to becoming a stem cell, a pluripotent stem cell, where by kind of coaxing that cell as it divides, you can have it sort of turn into lots of different kinds of cells. The cells that are part of sort of heart muscle, cardiomyocytes, are a type of cell where it's known what the sequence of sort of coaxings that you need to do to get from a stem cell to a heart muscle cell, what those coaxings are, and so you can make heart muscle cells. You could make them even in principle, though it's just an expensive, complicated thing. But you can make them even in principle for any particular person, which means that the cells you make would be accepted by the immune system of that person. They wouldn't be viewed as, oh, that's an alien thing that has to be attacked and rejected by the immune system. But so one could imagine, I suppose, something where if you can get the sort of the right sort of scaffold for an actual beating heart-like thing, you could fill it in with stem cells and have something which has sort of the same tissue type as an actual human heart. This problem of kind of what the mechanics should be like, that's been a difficult problem. It is my impression when it comes to artificial organs, there are different things, different organs with different levels of possibility. Company I happen to know has been working for a while on artificial lungs and making huge amounts of progress. And their basic approach is to 3D print at very high resolution the scaffold of the lung and then fill it in with stem cells. And then once you've got sort of a working lung set up that way, then you can sort of surgically attach it to the right blood vessels and the right place in the body. There's some evidence that kidneys may actually be easier to make that way than lungs. They're sort of a more, lungs have this feature, they actually move and so on. Kidneys don't. They just have things flowing through them, but they have a very elaborate pattern of kind of nested fractal pattern of sort of filtration elements inside them, and that seems like one of the things that's a more likely kind of artificial organ to get available. It's such a strange thing when you look at, like, I don't know, an MRI of a person or something. The fact that we are so modularly designed, there's just an organ here, an organ there, and you can just sort of imagine, saying, well, I'm going to replace this organ and reconnect the blood vessels and all that kind of thing. And of course, that's what happens in transplants, but that's a conceivable thing to do, is a remarkable piece of modularity, kind of an engineering style design. I think the way that natural selection and biological evolution have been able to work is that there is a certain degree of modularization. You can tweak the kidneys while separately tweaking the heart, so to speak, rather than having to do all of those things together. Although I certainly, having studied biological evolution recently, I realized that actually the surprise is that you actually can tweak lots of things together, which leads you with this sort of incomprehensibly complicated structure for the organism. Anyway, a few thoughts about bionic hearts, and the question of whether the bionic heart would allow the human to be better, stronger, whatever. I think the difficulty tends to be that it's a whole system of lots of connected things. So if you say, well, I'm going to be able to pump blood more quickly through the body, well, that's well and good. But if it doesn't oxygenate more quickly in the lungs, or if the capillaries can't withstand kind of the pressure of things being pushed through them, you're still going to be out of luck. It's kind of hard to say, well, I don't think that the limiting factor of what of most of sort of human performance, I don't think it's the heart. And I think it's a more system-wide kind of thing. I suppose I don't know that for sure, but that would be my impression. So just replacing that component, unless that component is failing for some reason, doesn't seem like it solves that problem. I have to say, in this whole question about sort of blood oxygenation, I guess I don't see why I shouldn't say it. Of all my personal quirks, and as somebody who's sort of studied the data about themselves quite a bit, I know I have a mutation in the hemoglobin gene that leads to some sort of it makes, well, the end result is the higher number of red blood cells that sort of can deliver more oxygen. Don't think it does. I don't know whether it does me much good. I've never been exactly oriented towards long distance running or anything like that. But it's a mutation that well, is the particulars of my particular mutation is not one that's in the literature, but there is a related mutation that is in the literature because of an incident that happened, I don't know, 30 years ago or something now, where a particular person, I think Norwegian person, who was winning a bunch of Olympic running things, and people were saying, "Oh, but you cheated. You doped yourself with erythropoietin, which is a thing that stimulates the production of red blood cells, and thereby increased your oxygen carrying capacity." And turned out that wasn't actually the case. In fact, this person had a mutation, a gain of function mutation in this particular gene that led to the production of more red blood cells. And so he kind of came by the attribute naturally, so to speak. And there's a whole chart and a series of papers that chart out the whole sort of family relations between this whole extended family, and some had got this mutation and some had not. My particular mutation doesn't happen to be one of the ones that was in that collection, but it's in the same gene and happens to have the same result, for better or worse. So far as I know, it has no adverse effect. And so far as I know, for me personally, it's had no positive effect either. But maybe, who knows, maybe it gives me more energy. I don't really know. I seem to have a reasonable amount of energy, but I don't think that's probably the cause. Let's see. Oh gosh, so many questions here. All right. Gosh, many interesting questions. Well, okay. Double Tribble asks, how would you think about a world in which all of the work is done by robots and AI? You know, what would they do? What's the work to be done? Question is, what do you want? Once you define what you want, automating how to get it is one thing, but there's still, quotes, work in what you want. You can't, there's no definition of what it is that you necessarily will want. In other words, you could say, well, I'm going to have robots constructing buildings and so on. And the robots, once I tell them what shape the building should be, they're going to construct the building. But somebody has to do the work to figure out, well, what shape of building do you want? Somebody could say, well, I kind of think I want a building that's in the shape of a mushroom or something. And but there's still, that's really the architecture work, so to speak, of what do you want the building to be like, is still work to be done. And almost by definition, that's not automatable. So I think what you get to see increasingly is a world in which sort of the creative act, the figuring out what to do act, is what becomes more and more important. And the actually mechanically doing it part becomes less and less important, much more and more automatable. I mean, we've already seen that in many things that have happened in the world, whether it's how we get from place to place, whether it's how we create things that in the past, now we can write high-level code to do it. I mean, the story of my life has been in large measure building our computational language, Wolfram language, to automate as much as possible about things that you want to do with computers. And that's a case where you could say, well, gosh, you know, and in fact, too many people still do write low-level code in, you know, C++ or Python or Java or something, and writing gobs and gobs of code in a very by hand kind of way, maybe these days with a little bit of help from AIs, but still writing out gobs of code where sort of one of my goals has been just automate that, make it be the case that the things one wants to do can be represented by a small number of functions in Wolfram language, and you just write those functions and you get to do what you need to do. And you've then just taken that month of work of writing this, you know, tens of thousands of lines of code and turned it into the 15 minutes of work to put together those 2 or 3 lines of Wolfram language code. That's what it looks like to kind of automate the world. But the thing you don't get to automate is to say, well, what do you want that code to do? That's a thing that's still a matter of human effort, almost by definition. So, I mean, you could just sort of say, well, I'm just going to delegate my life to the AI and say, just do with me as you think you should, so to speak. I think that, you know, that will, at least from my point of view, seems like an unfortunate endpoint for humanity, so to speak. The idea that one gets to the point where there is no more human input, so to speak. But in fact, in the direction that seems like one is going in is humans define the direction, automation automates what has to happen. Now, I mean, we're in a situation right now where an increasing amount of sort of intellectual activity can be automated once we define what we want. If we can specify what we want clearly enough, that's what computational language is all about, is being able to specify what you want. If you can specify it, you can get the actual doing of it automated. We haven't reached the same point in the physical mechanical world. We don't yet have robots that can go and build whatever we want, or molecular scale machinery that can build whatever molecules we want. We don't have that stuff yet. My guess is we'll get that stuff, and probably fairly soon. My guess is that just as it's turned out to be possible to have neural nets and so on do a reasonable job of generating human language given some sort of prompt about what you want it to be, my guess is that it'll be possible to have similar technology generate a reasonable sequence of operations that a robot can do to achieve the rough thing you've prompted it to do. And my guess is that the way we've built the world, humanoid robots will be a convenient kind of thing to have, because we've built the world with, doors with handles of a certain height that you turn with a hand, and with sort of stairs you can walk up and things like this. Those have all been built for humans. And, no doubt, if we were all configured like snakes or something, we wouldn't have doors that work the way they do. They'd be very inconvenient for snakes. But they are convenient for humanoid form factor things. And so it's convenient as a way to sort of have an interface to the world as we built it, to have humanoid type robots. And my guess is that it will be possibly quite suddenly, there will be the ability to go from sort of a prompt for, okay, robot, do this, to how do you turn that into a series of actions for the actuators that are the little motors that are controlling different parts of the robot and so on. So, what will that world be like? Again, a lot of things, so that there's a lot that we've been able to do with computers where the sophistication of things we're able to deal with is vastly greater than it ever was before. There are things we can build, construct in an abstract way, images we can create, things like this, that are incredibly much more ornate, more complex than we could do sort of step by step with our own hands. We haven't reached that point in the mechanical world quite yet, but we will. And that will mean that there are many kinds of things that we can expect to be much more complicated structures that we see in the kind of physical world. I mean, right now, it's convenient to be able to have, let's say, a mold that produces gazillions of things of the same shape. Okay, you can do 3D printing. It has its constraints as well. 3D printing is a bit more flexible in terms of all the kinds of shapes you can make. But I think what's kind of coming is, by the time kind of robotics is cheap and easy, there's much more ability to make all kinds of things in much more ornate ways. And I think the world will end up, for example, the distinction between what's a natural thing and what's an artifact will be harder to make. And that will be also true when we can get kind of molecular scale manufacturing going. I mean, right now, if you look at sort of the human constructed technological world versus the natural world, a good heuristic for what's kind of an artifact is it looks simpler than the natural world. I think that's a temporary phenomenon, basically. We can expect more elaborate things in our world. Now, those elaborate things, there's a question of, well, how do those relate to the objectives that we have? I mean, yes, you could have an incredibly elaborate kind of, you could have the chair that you're using could be incredibly elaborately contoured and structured and have all kinds of ornate pieces to it. But if the purpose is to sit on it and just sort of hang out, then it's not clear that makes any difference. But maybe it turns out that by adding that sort of ornate piece, it has some effect on the human, and that's of importance. Let's see. Well, Prutz is commenting, architects using computerized and AI tools will result in less demand for architects and thus less people doing architecture. I really doubt that that's true. I mean, I remember the transition from hand drafting in architecture to using things like AutoCAD and other CAD tools for architecture. And that there were many things that could then be done sort of more automatically, but that just meant people wanted to do more. 3D rendering is still not that common in architecture, partly because it's really pretty hard and takes a lot of time to kind of set things up in 3D. That's becoming much easier as a result of AI. And I think we can expect that we will routinely see 3D rendering, for better or worse. I mean, it hasn't proved to be all that important so far, but maybe that's just because it's so expensive to do that it's done so rarely that one isn't kind of used to seeing its results. And I think my strong guess in the case of architecture is that as the tools get stronger, there will just be the expectations will go up, and there'll just be more and more where it's like, well, why don't you draw, like right now, it's pretty common to have, template plans for things like houses. But and maybe that's good enough for most purposes. But I think it will be quite routine for these things to be always custom. Now, there's a good reason for them not to be custom, because if you want to have a window of a certain shape, well, someone can make one shape of window, but not another shape of window. But you get sort of robotics all the way down, it becomes possible to say, well, your window that has this weird curvy shape, okay, we can make that because it's just going to be, the AI talking to the robots, get that thing made. So my guess is that as there is more possibility to automate more, there will be actually more rather than less demand for sort of people to figure out, so what do you actually want? And because people are not going to do their own architecture. It's if they do, they'll mostly end up with things they don't want in the end. It's a hard thing to foresee what you're going to get. And it's also in a sense a very kind of personal development thing. You're going to build some house, and the house is kind of a representation of the way you lead your life, the way you expect to lead your life. It's a complicated loop that isn't really I don't know. There'll probably be the client meeting of the architect and the client saying, where the architect says, what do you want to achieve in this space or something? Maybe there'll be a round of that is kind of the AI getting the information and building what in architecture is called the program, not the same quite as a standard computer program, but the kind of the outline of what you're trying to do with the architecture. So anyway, my guess is that it'll just be the expectations will go up, and there'll be actually more need for kind of the human input on those kinds of things. Let's see. Zero asks, do you think the current methods of training and using AI and LLMs are here to stay, or is there a real possibility of an alternative machine learning approach appearing and being superior and more efficient? Well, that's a complicated story of the development of technology versus the science that underlies it and so on. I mean, I've even worked myself on trying to understand what makes machine learning work, and what is the essence of what makes machine learning work, and therefore what can you sort of streamline in doing machine learning. The fact that machine learning does things that we find useful is related, I think, to the fact that its architecture in a neural net, for example, is kind of roughly similar to the architecture of brains. Not in any detail similar, but it is sort of the phenomena that are involved are robust enough that they are sort of the same phenomena in brains and in artificial neural nets. And you can tweak the artificial neural net a lot, and it can still show the same phenomena. And so, you can say, well, I'm going to do better if I have this exact kind of transformer that does this and that, and I have, and in the end, it's probably not going to matter much. And that's been sort of one of the lessons of machine learning over the last 20 years or so, in the time that, or 15 years, in the time that it's really started to work well, is you bash it hard enough, you give it enough training. It's kind of, the architecture optimizes things a bit, but it's not critically important. I think that, so that's one dynamic. Another dynamic is, once an architecture sort of starts to work and people start to say, hey, this is really good, we're going to start optimizing it, building hardware, building libraries, building all these kinds of things that work on that architecture, then it ends up being the case that even if there was a better architecture, still if the chips have been made for one particular architecture and those chips were optimized to be 100 times more efficient than generic chips, that architecture is going to have a huge advantage over anything that comes later, just because there's been all this kind of detailed optimization for it. Now, can one do better? The answer is for sure, yes. Can one make smaller, more streamlined models? Yes. What are the models supposed to do? I've always seen kind of LLMs as being more than anything else kind of linguistic user interfaces, things that can take kind of the vagueness of human language and work with it, but ultimately provide an interface to more precise computational capabilities. And I think that we happen to be a main provider of kind of those lower level computational capabilities, knowing how to compute things in the world, knowing about the world, facts about the world. That's what our whole language technology stack is about. And in a sense, an emerging picture is there's the LLM sort of fuzzy linguistic interface that interfaces to the tools that are the kind of hard level of computation capability that is what we provide. And the question of what goes into the interface layer versus what gets done by the tool layer is an interesting question. We don't yet know how to make very fine-grained connections between the interface layer and the tool layer. It's mostly, okay, go think for a while as an LLM, run your LLM reasoning, whatever else. Once you're done with that, define how it is you want to call the tool, then go and produce a piece of orphan language code, go and actually run the thing, do that complicated computation, come back to the LLM with an answer. The LLM kind of wraps that answer, presents it to the humans, and so on. That's the current workflow. My guess is that there will be a more fine-grained version of that will become possible. Although my understanding now of how machine learning really works underneath makes that a little bit challenging, because machine learning seems to be this kind of way of assembling these kind of lumps of irreducible computation, these kind of powerful, strong, but awkwardly shaped, I could say, lumps of computation. And this is, when I say awkwardly shaped, that's a metaphorical version of kind of how it fits into the things you're trying to do. And I've given the analogy a bunch of times of sort of building a stone wall out of the rocks that you happen to find lying around that happen to fit in the gaps that you have. And that's, I think, what machine learning is doing on a sense in a much larger scale. And that the question of then how do you interface between this kind of awkwardly shaped rocks that happen to be building up your wall with the very precise kind of bricks that you make from doing actual computation? How do you make those interfaces? And can you make them on a fine-grained scale rather than just saying, I'm building the whole wall out of stone, and then, well, it's more or less flat at the top, so now I can start building with bricks on top of that, so to speak. I saw someone asked earlier about let's see, about spiking neural nets, I think. What is this? Let's see. Oh, I lost it. But I think there was a question about things where you're adding sort of more detail to the operation of an artificial neural net. My guess is that's sort of a waste of time. I mean, I think my own efforts kind of show that you can do machine learning with completely discrete systems. You don't need all the precise real numbers and so on that are the typical weights and activations of ordinary neural nets. You don't need, there's a lot, the main discovery is how much you don't need in the underlying structure of the neural net. You can have much simpler underlying structures from which sort of all the richness of typical neural net behavior can emerge. This is sort of an analogous story to the story that I've discovered many times, but originally 45 years ago, in connection with simple programs like cellular automata, where you have this very simple program, but yet when you run it, you can get very complicated behavior. You don't need a lot of complexity in the underlying structure to get sort of richness in the overall behavior. And my guess is the same is true with things like neural nets. The question, though, is a detailed question of, well, how hard do you have to train it? How hard do you have to bash it? How much money do you have to spend to do that training when it is set up one way versus another? And does it matter that you have this sort of more detailed spike timing information? Or does it matter that you have a particular way of connecting one neuron to another? Well, some of those things probably matter by a factor of 5, let's say. And factor of 5 is important most of the time if you're spending $1 billion to do the training, let's say. But it is might not be important if it took only 1 second to do some of this training. But so my guess is there's practical things, there's practical engineering tweaks. I doubt that it is of fundamental can you do it or not type significance. Let's see. I see the question was about spiking neural nets with non-differentiable learning algorithms. The basic idea in a typical neural net is you've set up your neural net, it's got all these connections and so on. The connections have parameters, the weights, and biases as well, but let's just say weights, which are just numbers. And so in a big neural net, you might have a 7 billion parameter network, maybe 7 billion weights. You can adjust these numbers, and that's how you get the neural net you want, is by having a fixed arrangement of where all these numbers are applied, but you tweak those numbers to get the neural net that knows to say, you know, the cat sat on the mat rather than the cat, tree, foot, light, whatever, some random sequence of words, that it did the right thing rather than the wrong thing. So the way you typically do that in training a neural net is you say, well, produce what you thought you should produce. Oops, that's not right. Let's try and move you from producing the thing you shouldn't have produced to producing the thing you should have produced. If the thing you're producing is just a number like 7 or something, and it's like you produced 7, you should have produced 5.5. Well, then you want to somehow tweak all those billions of numbers inside the neural net so that the next time you generate the output, it won't be 7, it'll be closer to 5.5. And so the typical method of doing that is to say, well, when you get that number, 7, let's say, that number is the result of applying this function, that function, that function, a whole sequence of functions, each of which has certain parameters in it. It's a composition of functions that you've applied. Well, now there's an important fact of calculus, which is when you have a composition of functions, f of g of h or whatever, then and you say, let me differentiate, let me see what is the change of the results of f of g of whatever, what is that change as you change the input to those functions. And so calculus gives you, through the chain rule, the way that composition of functions, the way that you get the result of a small change on the result of the composition. And the answer is that it's essentially a multiplication of terms. Essentially, every small change for every individual function gets multiplied to get the change for the whole system. Well, and then you can kind of invert that process and say, well, given that I know that I want to change the whole system this way, then I can sort of propagate backwards that change and say how much change to apply in each of these individual functions. That's roughly how it works. And that's the idea of backpropagation, which is used a lot in neural net training. Well, if you have a discrete system, this whole idea of make a small tweak as you say, I've got the wrong answer at the end. Okay, what do I have to tweak? What small tweaks do I have to make in the system to get closer to the right answer? You can't do that in quite the same way, because ordinary calculus, with this thing where the composition of functions, the change in the composition of functions is a product, is a multiplication of small changes, it doesn't quite work that way when things aren't continuous like that. But there is, in fact, still a Boolean version of backpropagation, which I actually worked out and wrote down a few months ago. And in fact, in principle, you can do the exact same thing. When you have these discrete systems, you can say, oh, the result was this change. How do I know, how is that change associated with the individual changes in, let's say, the individual functions? there's a catch. The catch is that it isn't unique. When you go and try and say, how do I backpropagate? How do I invert that process? It's unlike the continuous case, which happens to be unique in the way that you do that inversion. The discrete case is not unique. There are many paths of inversion that you can follow. And actually, it turns out, at least based on what I studied, that just making random mutations and just saying, flip this bit at random and see whether you get a better or worse answer is about as good as doing this Boolean backpropagation. So it's not, I mean, this is all to say that it doesn't really seem to matter much whether you have continuous system with backpropagation, whether you have this discrete system where you're just doing mutations and so on. If the lesson of machine learning seems to be that there's a certain universality, that if you just have this overall architecture and you push it hard enough, it will successfully learn. Let's see. Gosh, another machine learning question from Almond. Saying, I read from an expert that correcting the errors in a later prompt results in more errors. It's better to go back to the original prompt. Well, I'm not sure what later prompt means, but in oh, I see. If you start off, maybe if you say to an LLM, tell me about the elephant that lives on the moon or something, and it starts writing a bunch of stuff, and then eventually it says, and it's written something, or maybe something less silly than that, where it's writing something, but it goes a bit off track. And then you say, oh, okay, LLM, you went off track, try it again type thing. To some extent, that will tend to work well, because the way that current LLMs, although not probably for much longer, work is they're always just taking what they wrote so far and predicting from that what they should write next. So they never kind of have a plan for what's happening. That's less true in reasoning models, where reasoning models tend to start off with kind of an outline plan that they then try to fill in. But in the sort of classic LLM story, it's kind of like, just I've got what I've got so far. Now I'm going to kind of project forwards. And so what can happen is it writes out something it's writing out, it's projecting forwards, and then you say to it, that's wrong. And it will say, oh, yes, you're right. I can see now that that's wrong, and let me apologize for that and go fix it. The reason it can then do that is because now it's looking backwards. It can see all of that stuff. When it was generating forwards, it couldn't plan what it was going to do, so it couldn't see that it was making a mistake or about to make a mistake. Now, I think in terms of this question of can you put it back on track when it's gone off track, without by some kind of prompting beyond just saying, look at what you wrote and redo it. I'm not sure. I don't have my intuition agrees with what you're saying, that you're better off going back to the original prompt and early in the sequence and trying to fix it, rather than trying to say, I think the issue is this. The issue is that the LLM can see what it wrote before, and it's going to be, in a sense, biased to just repeat its mistakes. And so it can be quite difficult to say, ignore what you've done and, ignore the man behind the curtain, so to speak, and ignore what's been written so far, go do something fresh, so to speak. I think it's a bit similar to, as a human, you can do something and you're trying to figure something out, and you realize that you're in a rut because you figured out what you figured out, you remember what you figured out. It's hard to break out of that. And I think LLMs have the same kind of issue. I mean, it's a general point that kind of the psychology of LLMs is an important sort of emerging area. And there are humans that get better and less good intuition about sort of how the LLMs think about things. But I think it's a coming important profession, so to speak. Let's see. More AI here. Quantum is asking, do I or our team actively work on alignment issues with AI? Are you worried about the next 10 years with regard to that? I've done a fair amount of work on that. I don't consider it very satisfactory. I think the issue is, at some level, is, well, what do you want the AIs to do? And there's sort of a fundamental difficulty, which is, as soon as the AIs are doing computational kinds of things, whatever the way you try and tweak the AI at the beginning, saying, I want you to just be a good AI, you'll never be able to do that successfully. Because of this phenomenon I call computational irreducibility, it's sort of inevitable that just because you know the rules doesn't mean you're going to know everything that will happen. Actually, if you did know everything that would happen, what's the point of doing the thing you're going to do? You might as well just say, well, I know the answer. Well, sort of that means that even though you may think you built the best AI in the world that's going to do the best things and so on, it's still, there will be unexpected, unintended consequences that will be inevitable as a result of it being a kind of irreducible computational system. So in a sense, the idea that, look, we're just going to be able to make the AIs do the right thing and never do the wrong thing, just not going to work that way. Now, the extent, and even at the level of saying, well, let's control the actuation layer of AIs. Let's control the AIs so that they might have weird thoughts, and we allow them freedom of thought, so to speak. We allow them to think whatever crazy thoughts they want to think. That somewhere inside that AI, you could, in principle, detect some signal that would be a signal that says exterminate all the humans. But it doesn't matter, you might say, so long as at the actuation layer, you prevent the AI from actuating, from actualizing its idea that's happened somewhere in its incomprehensible sort of set of things that are going on inside the AI, where it formed the thought of exterminate the humans. But you don't let it actually actuate, exterminate the humans. Now, first point is, it's pretty much impossible to say I can define what it means for the inside of the AI to form the thought, exterminate the humans. It's just a bunch of bits. And those bits don't form coherently until you're kind of at the output level. It's just like in human brains. We have all kinds of neuron firings going on and things happening inside our brains, but it's only when it gets sort of coherent enough and it gets kind of knitted together to the point where it becomes actuated and you say the next word, that sort of it becomes concrete enough to be important. I mean, I'm sure that somewhere there's a neuron in my brain right now that's effectively that if you sort of picked it out and tried to identify what is it thinking, it's thinking something totally bizarre, totally irrelevant. But as it gets sort of entrained in what am I going to say next, that the efforts of that neuron get ignored. And so hopefully I say something sensible next. And so it will be with AIs. And if you say to the AI, hey, you can have no bad thoughts anywhere inside you, whatever it means to form a thought for an AI, which we can discuss, but that's, again, a complicated concept. So that's sort of, you don't want to do that. So now at the actuation layer, you can say, well, never give the AI a gun or something, or never let the AI have access to some critical control system in the world. Well, that's all well and good until somebody realizes that, well, actually, we'll do a pretty good job running that control system. So why don't we just let it do it? It's going to be better than the humans at doing it. And then it's got access to that actuation layer. But also, even at the level of, even if it's just an AI in a box, so long as it's talking to humans, humans are an actuation layer. The AI can convince the human, do something totally crazy. That's, we see that in sort of social media, in selecting content and so on in social media. There have been lots of situations in which, in effect, the AI has gotten the humans all riled up, and that's so the actuation layer has nothing to do with the AI. It's nothing to do with and the AI is an autonomous weapon or anything like that. It's just the AI is riling up the humans who will then go, in effect, be the foot soldiers for it and actuate for it. So it's tricky to do that. I mean, I've certainly thought about what would be sort of the things you could imagine trying to define as overall principles for the operation of AIs. I think it's really quite difficult. And I think that the one thing it does is it shines a very bright light on the question of sort of what do you want the world to be like? And people will sometimes say, well, I just want the AIs to do what the humans do. And then you point out all the terrible things that humans do. People say, well, no, not what the humans actually do, what the humans aspire to do. Okay, how do we know what the humans aspire to do? Well, that's a big mess because we're saying, well, somebody, there's some book somewhere, religious text, self-help book, whatever, that says this is what humans should aspire to do. But some people will say that's great. Some people will say that's terrible. There is no unified answer to that. There is no kind of, and this is what humans, all 8 billion of them, so to speak, sort of aspire to do. And you could say, well, that human aspires, has the wrong aspirations because, well, that human grew up in a situation where they were given the wrong aspirations. Well, you quickly recurse into hopelessness. You either have to say, well, take the humans as they are, or not. By the time you say take the humans as they should be, could be, it's you recurse into nothingness, so to speak. So I think it's very challenging at many levels, and I think my operational statement is just do sensible things. Don't do things that are, there are plenty of things you could imagine doing that are just, if you think it through even for a short time, you realize this is just a bad idea. I think that's the best we can do right now. I think my level of kind of concern that sort of the AIs are going to run off and do things we don't want them to do is kind of modest, because I think the big story of AI right now is kind of where the AI is inserted. The AI is it's like an enabling technology, but what is it enabling? What are you actually building from it? And that's much more the story of where things are going, I think. Primate, interesting name given the question, asks, do you see a danger in the trend towards anthropomorphic AI and providing AI systems with human-like attributes? It's comfy for us humans. I mean, we could say, let's make a user interface that has nothing familiar on it. There's a lot of learning you have to do to use a user interface that has nothing familiar. Better to leverage the things we know so that we can more easily and more comfortably kind of interact with those things. And so it is, I think, with AIs, that if we can leverage kind of what we already know about interacting with humans to be able to more smoothly interact with AIs, it's going to be a lot easier for us. I mean, I know in language design, designing our full language computational language, a big part of that story is we get to leverage English. We get to take a word like nest and say, okay, so when we have functions nesting, f of g, f of f of f of f of f, whatever, we can use the word nest to describe that. It's if we had to call that thing, F724, it would be much harder to learn the language. We're able to leverage English, people's knowledge of English, in giving them a leg up in learning our computational language. And that's kind of an important thing. And I think similarly in user interfaces, leveraging what you already know is important. Now, there was a trend for a while towards skeuomorphic user interfaces where you had kind of the leather desk surface type imitation. I think that's less necessary, and it seemed like that didn't go that well. I think that there's an interesting question is whether the kind of avatar should be a kind of a detailed human face with wrinkled skin and all that kind of thing, and where you kind of maybe subconsciously can see the blood pulsing type thing, or whether what you really want is a cartoon that captures somehow the cartoon essence of the avatar that might be talking to you. I kind of suspect the cartoon essence will actually work better than the very sort of directly skeuomorphic, human-like avatar and so on. But, I think at some level, everything we do with computers and such like leverages the concepts we already have. I mean, I myself have spent some time kind of exploring the raw computational universe. It's a magnificent place out there, but it is not sort of easy to understand. It's not something that fits in with us humans as we humans currently are. Let's see. Spare Parts asks, I wonder what will happen when future AI models are trained on material that shows them the actual results of their past actions. That's an interesting point. I mean, it's kind of like many control systems at a much simpler level are being trained, in effect, from, if you sort of put that flap on the aeroplane down, that aileron down at this point, then this will happen, and you can kind of update your model of the aeroplane by seeing what happened the last time you did that. So yeah, I would expect that, that's been a long time kind of almost reinforcement learning type idea, of feedback control type idea of how to learn from what has gone before. That's an interesting thought, that the AIs get to learn from kind of seeing the outcomes of their past successes and failures. Of course, there has to be in the end a fitness function, a loss function, a reward function, something which says, yeah, you did really well. That was a good thing you did there. I mean, otherwise you get a situation where the AI has to have a ground truth for what's good. Otherwise, it doesn't have a way to assess whether its past actions were good or bad. I mean, the past action could have really cleaned up the neighborhood, so to speak, by exterminating all the humans. And that would be, at least as far as the humans are concerned, would not be thought of, I think, as a good outcome. And at least I wouldn't think of it as a good outcome. But you have to kind of define that ground truth, or you don't have really a way to discuss that. Let's see, maybe one more question, and then I need to go back to my day job here. Des asks, what are some near and medium-term breakthroughs that could potentially make their creator a trillionaire? Des says off the top of their head, fusion power, far more efficient batteries, novel propulsion systems. It's interesting because the first question is, what will be trillion-dollar industries? And the second question is, what is likely to be concentrated enough that, some particular person is going to be the kind of the sort of the owner of a lot of that. I mean, if you look at things about the web and sort of the deployment of the web and all of the infrastructure associated with the web, could it have been the case that that was sort of a single person, single entity owned build out? I'm not sure. I think there are things that tend to kind of become the work of many, and there are things that have more possibility to be kind of, I just had this good idea. I mean, yes, I do think that sort of if somebody cracked controlled fusion, and if somebody could make a little fusion battery that could be made small, and that would certainly be a super valuable thing that I suppose one could imagine could be kind of fairly narrowly kind of owned and so on. Well, I think there'll be things, it's a lot of detail about deployment because, it's one thing to say, oh, I invented this way of making robotics really work and humanoid robots that really work. But it's a question of does that become a thing where it's, well, like from the original 1929 or so movie of Rossum's Universal Robots, I think it was called. Is there a future Rossum, so to speak, who just controls all the robots in the world? Or is it not going to sort of play out that way? I think when it comes, so an interesting question is what's the trade-off between the software type story of, oh, I made a search engine and ran ads against it, or I made a giant ad network, or I made a social network, a social media network, or whatever else? What are the things that are pure sort of software versus the things that involve making a widget? And what's the trade-off between those things? And um, I'm not sure off the top of my head that I'm coming up with. I mean, there are many possibilities one could sort of imagine, and there are many where it's like, really, could that actually become that significant? Hard to know. I think, it is funny that if you look at these things like email, for example, in most countries, not heavily concentrated and owned, a thing which is just sort of out there. Social media or even search, something that tends to have been quite centralized, even though it didn't really need to be. Same with social media, same with messaging. There are things which have been quite centralized and there are things which really have not been. And I think it's a little hard to predict and a little history dependent which are centralized and which are not. I mean, there are things where just the infrastructure cost, at least at the beginning, is high enough that there's a force towards centralization. There are ones where things centralize even when that isn't the case. There are ones where things centralize as a result of brand, and people say, well, I want the cool version, and it's called this, and that's a central thing, and so on. So hard for me to predict, but I think it's an interesting. I would guess that there are possibilities on either side of the hardware-software divide that get you to that point. Now, of course, it's a quite different question what the dynamics of the world around sort of a thing of sufficient value that it's going to mint trillionaires type thing, what the dynamics of the world around that will look like, and how governments feel about that, and so on. I mean, that's been a complicated issue, and well, certainly in the US and historically, of sort of the actually in other countries as well. Although in many other countries, the big quotes companies were actually government offshoots from the beginning, whereas in the US it's been more, I think, it's the company and it's the government, and which one is sort of more powerful in the situation. Anyway, a few thoughts on that. All right, I think it's time for me to go back to my day job, and thank you all for lots of interesting questions and comments that get me to think about a lot of things I don't usually think about. This is the way that I try to keep my brain oiled, so to speak. And I really appreciate you all being along on this journey, and hope you find these things interesting. Thanks very much, and see you another time.